There are only 3 times in the year that the church celebrates a birthday. December 25th, the birthday of Jesus. September 8th, the birthday of our Blessed Mother. And June 24th, the birth of John the Baptist. As we recall the events surrounding his birth, there are great similarities between his birth and the birth of Jesus. Both were announced by an angel. Both parents had not planned on having a baby. And the name given to the child was chosen by God himself. In our gospel today, we see that Elizabeth, his mother, defies family tradition. The relatives and neighbors were sure that his name would be Zechariah. But she said no. His name is John. Not wanting to believe her or take her seriously, they motioned to the father, Zechariah, who, by the way, was mute because he questioned the angel about this birth. And he motioned for a tablet, and he wrote, "John is his name." And they were all amazed and filled with wonder. John is translated as God is gracious. God is gracious. It's fascinating to realize that this child, before he uttered a word, by his very name, spoke about the graciousness and the power and the hope of God that would be found in Jesus the Christ. When an aging, childless couple bring about new life, God is gracious. When the impossible is made possible, God is gracious. When miracles happen when we least expect them, God is gracious. And today, you and I, living in today's society and world, need to know that God is gracious. Because this gracious God offers us a precious and elusive commodity: hope. Hope for something more. Hope for something better. You and I live in a world where the news we hear every day is numbing, distressing, depressing. We continue to hear of scandals in the church, of political mudslinging, of economic anxiety, of nations warring against one another, of senseless violence in our neighborhoods and cities, and of families being separated here and around the world. And when we hear all this numbing, depressing, distressful news, we can easily be tempted to forget one simple truth: God is gracious, and this gracious God gives us hope. We might ask ourselves today, why is John the Baptist so important in salvation history, in the life of the church that we remember his birthday? Is it because of the mystery surrounding his birth? The significance of his name? The fact that he lived a harsh life in the desert, clothed in camel skin, eating locust and wild honey? Is it because of his harsh and challenging preaching to the self-righteous Pharisees? His standing up to King Herod and saying, "You are a sinner," which, by the way, cost him his life. The reason why John the Baptist is so important in salvation history and the life of the church is because of his finger. Yes, his finger. For John pointed out to others Jesus, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. His whole life, his whole mission was simply to point others to Jesus who would bring about salvation and redemption for all. And you and I today need to be grateful and thankful for John pointing his finger to Jesus. For Jesus has granted us the gift of his salvation. You and I, by the way, who are finger pointers. We are. Sadly and unfortunately, when we point our fingers, it's not to Jesus, but it's to one another. And we shouldn't be all that surprised. It happened in the very beginning of the human family. Let's go back to the Garden of Eden. And God one night wants to take a walk with Adam and Eve, but he couldn't find them. They were hiding because they were ashamed. They found themselves without any clothes. So God asked them, "Adam, did you eat of the fruit I told you not to eat?" And Adam's response, "The woman you gave me made me eat it." First words we hear from Adam, blaming Eve and God himself. So God turns to the woman and says, "Why did you do that?" "The serpent made me do it." And from that point till now, we, the descendants of Adam and Eve, continue to point our finger of blame, our finger of anger, our finger of condemnation. It's all your fault. It's all their fault. We constantly point our fingers and blame, taking no responsibility for our own actions. And that's why we need today's feast. That's why we need John the Baptist to remind us that when things go wrong, when life seems to be falling apart, let's not point our fingers at one another, but point ourselves and others to Jesus. Jesus, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. And the more faithful we are in pointing others to Jesus in stressful times, the more consistent we are in pointing ourselves to Jesus to resolve what's going on in our lives, the more faithful we are in pointing to Jesus, we will come to discover that we will live in the culture of Jesus. The culture of Jesus that says all life is sacred, from the moment of conception till one takes their last natural breath, and everything and everyone in between. When we find ourselves living in the culture of Jesus, we come to realize the sanctity of every family, no matter who they are or where they come from. When we live in the culture of Jesus, we come to discover that the world in which we live is a gift from God, not to be used and abused, but to be cared for and nurtured and passed on to future generations. When you and I find ourselves pointing to Jesus, the Lamb of God, hope comes into our lives. When you and I point to Jesus, forgiveness and mercy comes into our lives. When you and I point to Jesus, the Lamb of God, he nourishes us with his body and his blood. When you and I point to Jesus, the Lamb of God, he strengthens us by his words from the Gospels to be God's holy people. Let us live in the culture of Jesus, a culture of life, a culture of dignity and respect, a culture of peace and justice, a culture of love.